Hi, good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Kim Quinn with SensCy, and today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. So most cybersecurity webinars tend to focus on threats and technology and trends or statistics. Today we're going to look at cybersecurity through an investigative lens. Which we thought was an interesting angle. So, what we're going to be doing is focusing on three different but recent cybersecurity incidents. And as I mentioned, we'll look at them through the lens of a forensic investigator. Thankfully for you, that will not be me. But we'll explore what happened, talk through what we know, what we don't know, and most importantly, the lessons that business leaders can take away and learn from these incidents. So, the title of today's session is Reconstructing Three Breaches Beyond the Firewall. And by the end of our time together, I hope you'll see why the most important cyber risks today are often emerging outside of the places that organizations tend to focus their security efforts. So, a couple quick housekeeping items before we dig in. First, all attendees' lines are muted, and by the end of our session today, we will have a Q&A period. So encourage you to use the chat or the Q&A feature to send questions throughout the session, but we will hold them until the end. And yes, finally, today's presentation will be recorded and we'll provide you with it afterwards. So why don't we go ahead and move into the agenda, and I'll share with you where we're headed. So we'll start by discussing how investigators approach an incident and why that mindset matters. Then we're going to examine three very different incidents. First, Canvas, Coinbase, and then we'll end with discussing the SuperBox incident. Then at first glance, I would say these incidents look, or that you probably should assume at this point that these incidents, and you would be correct, they're quite different, but there are some similarities. So one of them involves a software provider, of course, Canvas. One involves insider assisted access, the Coinbase one, and then the Superbox incident is actually related to a consumer streaming device. So we'll see how these together kind of reveal something about the trends and what we're seeing in terms of how cyber risk is evolving in organizations. And then we'll close by connecting the dots on these three incidents and discuss again what that means for you and your organizations and lessons you can take away from these incidents. So I'll move forward by introducing you to our speaker today. Dave Kelly is co-founder and CTO here at SensCy. And prior to the founding of SensCy, Dave spent 26 years with the Michigan State Police, and he retired there as captain and director of technology after leading the Michigan Cyber Command Center and the Michigan Intelligence Operations Center. His experience is extensive in cyber command, threat intelligence, digital forensics, and security operations centers. He also helped develop Michigan's first cyber incident response plan. He's directed statewide security audits and is recipient of the National State Scoop Cybersecurity Leadership Award. And throughout Dave's career, one thing has remained consistent, and that's that the most valuable lessons come from studying real incidents. Not because every organization will experience the same attack, but because every incident reveals something about how threat actors think, how organizations respond, and where risk can often hide, even in plain sight. So that's a perspective that I'm grateful that Dave will be bringing to today's discussion. So at this time, I will welcome again and turn it over to you, Dave.
Awesome. Thanks, Kim. Greatly appreciate the introduction and welcome everyone. I'm happy you're here today. And hopefully when we get done, you'll have some questions. So, as Kim mentioned, today we're going to be kind of unpacking three very recent incidents that, on the surface, might seem unrelated, but we'll tie together kind of how they're related. The first one we're going to talk about is Canvas. The Canvas breach resulted in about 9,000 institutions being affected and the lockout of about 30 million users. And for those of you who don't know, Canvas is used in higher education and also K through 12 education. It's one of the main platforms that's used there. Second, we're going to talk about is Coinbase, which is a cryptocurrency platform. Um, and that incident impacted about 70,000 users and also resulted in a lot of users' accounts being drained of their personal cryptocurrency. And then finally, we're going to talk about something called SuperBox. This is a streaming TV device, Android-based streaming TV device. And when users install it, they're unknowingly sharing information with state-sponsored cyber operators, specifically in China. So we're going to talk about that one as well and how that works. So what connects these three incidents? I think the real common thread here is that all of these threats were introduced from the outside in. So a trusted vendor, a legitimate user, a connected device, or a third-party relationship. So that's kind of how they tie together. Um, and what we're seeing today and what makes this webinar really important is outside threats are the fastest growing category in cybersecurity. In fact, Verizon reported that in 2025, 48% of breaches involved a third party. In 2024, that was only 30%. So we've got a 60% increase in this type of attack. So we thought it would be appropriate to sort of let you know what happened and what we can do, how leadership should think about this when they're doing their cybersecurity planning.
Great. All right. So actually, why don't we kick off a poll? We thought it might be interesting to get a sense from the audience on areas of concern for you. So let me go ahead and launch this poll, and it should pop up on your screen now. And the question is, which area concerns you most? With the options being third party slash vendor risk, insider risk, remote work slash device risk, or not sure. And there is no right or wrong answer, but we would love to get a sense of your perspective, which will help us kind of drive today's discussion. And interestingly, we'll ask the question again at the end of our session and see if your thoughts have evolved over the course of our time together. And we'll give it another second. All right, it looks like everyone who's going to participate has done that. So I'm going to go ahead and share the results. And you can see that we've got a little over half saying third party slash vendor risk. We have 5% saying insider risk, 33% remote work or device risk, and then 5% not sure. Dave, thoughts, surprises, expected?
No, I think the top two are pretty expected. I think, let's take the second one first. We've gone to a distributed workforce. I think there's a lot of people going back to the office, but there's still a significant amount that are distributed. So I'm happy folks are thinking about that. And then the fact that third-party vendor risk is high on this list is a really good sign because we've seen, I think, um, I can't remember what the actual percentage, but a very large percentage increase in third-party vendor risk associated attacks. So it's good to see that people are thinking about those two things.
All right, excellent. All right, very good. Go ahead and move on here.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about just how a forensic investigator sort of approaches an incident. And why when we're investigating, like what are we looking for? And Why is that important? So when an incident occurs, um, the investigator's goal is really just understand what does the evidence support. So what was the vector? How did they get in? And what was the variant? What did they deploy, right? Those are the things we're sort of looking for. So in each incident today, we're going to go through a couple of questions like, what do we know? What does the available evidence support? And what should leaders learn from that evidence, right? As we talk through these three incidents. And this is a framework that we kind of use to kind of separate the signal from the noise. It's really important if you do have an incident to do a forensic investigation, because if we just spin our systems back up, and we don't close off what happened, or we don't know exactly how this breach happened, it's going to happen again. So, one thing I will note that everything we're going to discuss today is based on publicly available information, company disclosures, and security research that's available as of June 18th. Our purpose here is not to assign blame, because we're going to talk about some very specific company breaches here. It's just to understand the incident and extract the lessons that we can all learn, so we can all make better decisions. All right, so the first one we're going to talk about is Canvas. And you can jump to the next slide. So many of you are probably familiar with Canvas, but for those of you that are not, it's one of the most widely used learning management platforms in the world. Um, Earlier this year, the platform experienced an actual ransomware incident that affected thousands of educational institutions and literally millions of users. For those organizations that were impacted, this wasn't just an IT problem. I mean, classes were interrupted, students couldn't access coursework, faculty couldn't access the systems they depend on. And it happened, of course, because threat actors know timing, right? Timing is important. It happened during one of the busiest times of the academic year. So this incident really should matter to every organization, because it involved a third party, right? And this is a third party risk situation. So let's jump in and sort of unpack it here. So what do we look at first? Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, first we look at the evidence. Here's what we know. It's a third-party learning management system used by thousands of educational institutions. And interestingly, most, especially higher education institutions, have their own branded instance of Canvas. So this is important because the users, right, believe this is a university provided tool. And that really matters from a institutional reputation perspective, right? If I have a solution that's white labeled and I brand it as SensCy, to my users, that's a SensCy solution, right? So if there's an incident that happens, it's going to fall back on me as the SensCy leader. So what happened was during the attack, users tried to log into the system and they actually saw a ransomware note. So many of them thought they had ransomware in their own machines, which caused some pretty widespread panic. They did not have ransomware on their machines. The application did have ransomware on it, but when you log in and you see that screen, obviously, it caused a lot of fear and concern. So what happened? The threat actor actually created a free for teacher account, and then they submitted a support ticket, and in that support ticket there was malicious code. And so when the customer service agent opened that support ticket, that code executed. So very unique threat path. Once that malicious code activated, the attacker was able to then obtain an authorization token, which gave them elevated access inside Canvas to deploy this ransomware across all of those individual instances of Canvas that all of these educational institutions had. So looking at the slide here, we have a threat actor, we have a third-party service provider, we have a trusted business system, right? Because everybody's using it and trusting it. And then we have end user or customer impact. So where the story really becomes kind of relevant to the audience is most organizations rely on dozens, and some of you that are big, maybe hundreds of vendors and suppliers to do your day-to-day business. We have payroll providers, cloud providers, software vendors. We probably have consultants that maybe have access to our systems. If we're in manufacturing, we might have parts suppliers that we rely on, right? All of those folks should be considered third parties. And the challenge is that every one of those relationships introduces some level of risk. So many organizations don't have a clear understanding of which suppliers create the greatest impact if they were compromised, and that's something that we should definitely examine. So the bottom line is a vendor's security weakness quickly becomes our own weakness if we don't understand their cybersecurity posture, and we don't have to be breached directly for us to experience some consequences of that. So, what do we take away from this? I think the key message is third-party risk is operational business risk. I mean, that's what it is. When a critical supplier experiences a cyber incident, our business can be affected immediately, and our reputation and our revenue can be impacted, right? Because that incident's going to be fall back on us, even if it was one of our suppliers that it happened to. So everyone on this call should really be examining which third parties are integrated with your systems, which third parties have your data, which third parties do you rely on to conduct business? And that might not always be your IT providers. We were talking to a hospital recently, and they said their number one fear and third-party risk is their elevator provider, right? Those elevators are connected to the internet, and if one of those goes down, they can't move patients, right? So it isn't always an IT problem. And if those elevator systems went down because that elevator company had a breach, that would be a big problem for the hospital. So, and like the Canvas incident, right? If you're white labeling someone else's technology and deploying it as your own, we definitely need to know what the cyber posture is of that organization. So if any of these apply to you, you need to have a third-party risk program in place that helps you understand if your supplier's cybersecurity posture and ensure they maintain minimum cybersecurity standards. Why? Again, because if they go down, your customers will be impacted, and that could impact not only your revenue, but could impact your customer retention, right? So it's something we need to think about, and it's something we need to plan for. All right, let's move on from vendor risk to insider threat, insider risk. This Coinbase incident is pretty fascinating because it challenges how we often think about cyber attacks. You can jump to the next slide. So when people hear about a breach, most of the time they're imagining, sophisticated malware, some nation state actor, or some, advanced technical exploit that happened. And a lot of times, when we read about these cases, everybody always says, oh, it was a sophisticated attack, right? That's not always the case. And that's not what happened here. So according to Coinbase's public disclosures, these attackers actively recruited and bribed overseas support personnel who already had legitimate access to the company systems, right? This is an important distinction. They didn't break in. They found someone who would let them in, which is something we need to think about. So the result was access to customer information, which was later used in social engineering campaigns and extortion attempts. So what makes this case so powerful is it wasn't a technology story, it was really a human story. So let's walk through the attack path because we need to think about what could we have done to prevent this from happening. So the attackers first identified people with access that could be useful. They recruited them, in this case, bribed them. Once that happened, they gained access to something every attacker wants, right? Legitimate access to the system. So at that point, our traditional tools become ineffective, right? The user's authenticated, they appear legitimate, the activity doesn't appear suspicious, right? So from there, the threat actors were able to send emails to actual Coinbase customers that looked legitimate, right? Which then allowed them to steal money from these customer accounts, right? By telling them they need to do a password reset. There were all kinds of social engineering campaigns that they launched against the Coinbase customers. And some of them lost real money over this incident. And sometimes that money was very significant. So again, it's important to note there was no malware, there was no zero-day exploit, there was no sophisticated technical attack. The attack succeeded because a trusted relationship was compromised and effective policy was really missed. And that's a reminder that attackers will always look for the easiest path to their objective, right? Sometimes that path is technical, but sometimes it's not. So when people hear about an incident like this, I think the first question is, well, there has to be a security tool that could have prevented this, right? In this case, the answer is there wasn't one. This was not a tool failure. It was really a policy, access management, and trust failure. So while every organization, we all depend on trust, we trust our employees to do their jobs. The real question we should be asking here is what controls and policies could we have had in place that would have prevented these employees from being able to do what they did, right? And one takeaway you should always have, one takeaway I want you to have from this webinar is cybersecurity done well requires more than tools, right? It requires sound policy as well. And that's something that often gets overlooked. And that policy needs to be understood by leadership. And I'll explain why that's important. So what does this mean for you? This is where the lesson's a bit personal. Most organizations spend a lot of time thinking about like external threats, and that's very appropriate. But incidents like this sort of remind us that legitimate access also carries risks, right? Every new access point creates an opportunity for misuse. And that doesn't mean we should stop trusting our people and we can't function without trust. But it does mean that trust should be supported by proper controls. So things like access reviews, separations of duties, separations of access, right? Escalation procedures before we authorize somebody to do something, right? And the bottom line is, in the Coinbase case, the question is, why did the customer service agents have the ability to provision new internal accounts? Why did they have that permission? I don't know the answer to that. I'm quite sure it was probably a business decision. There was probably some friction going on, and they needed somebody to be able to provision accounts, so they put it to these overseas customer service agents to do so. But it's a good example of policy could have prevented it. We could have made sure if somebody from the cyber team was engaged with the leadership team when this decision was made, right? We could have had some controls in place, escalation procedures, right? If they're going to provision a new account, it has to go to another layer of permission, right? Or do we really want to have folks abroad provisioning accounts at all? Or should that be something that's more close to home? So those are the things we need to think about. What do our users have permission to do, and why on the business side is that important? And if it is important, how do we mitigate that risk as best as we can? So leadership lessons. First, understand who has access to your most sensitive systems and data. I think that sounds obvious, but a lot of organizations we see struggle to answer this, like who has access to what. Second, think about what does this access allow the user to do? Like in this case, they had access, but they also were able to provision brand new accounts that looked like legitimate at Coinbase.com accounts. Third, you got to remember that access isn't permanent, right? People change roles, responsibilities involved, the business changes. Access needs to evolve as well. So if there's one takeaway, it's trust is important, but trust should also be continuously validated, right? And that's true for employees, it's true for contractors, and it's really true for every account that we have to all of our critical business systems. Our policy and how we do things matters just as much as our security tools. All right. Next one I want to talk about, and this one's I find to be very interesting, is something called SuperBox. So this one is a little bit different. Um, Canvas involved a vendor, right? The vendor was the cause of our incident. Coinbase involved trusted users and probably policy that could have been done better. But SuperBox really involves just a consumer device, right? What is SuperBox? It's a streaming TV box that offers free local channels. Why should you care about a consumer streaming device? Because many of you and your employees are working from home. In fact, today I happen to be doing this webinar from my home office, right? While I'm connected to SensCy systems. So the SuperBox story isn't really about a streaming device so much as it's about understanding how cyber risk can enter environments that we don't have control over. So a little bit about SuperBox, a little bit more detail. Why it's attractive to people and why people buy it is it promises a free TV, free local TV service, right? Which is the one hard thing to get. You can buy all these different streaming services, but when you want your local channels, that's what causes you have to, upgrade your package. The crazy thing is you can buy it on Walmart online, you can buy it on Amazon online, but what it requires you to do is to download an app to enjoy that, local TV channels without those monthly payments. But what we found is once that app was installed, the box immediately reached out to Tencent infrastructure in China, and the person's home network that the box was on began to run slow. Not noticeably slow where you would sort of notice it, but slower than it should be running. Second, the box started aggressively sending what we call address resolution protocols requests across the local network. So, for non-technical folks on the call, an ARP is a basic way that one device asks who else is on the network. So, when another device answers, it reveals what's called its MAC address, which is the hardware identity used on the local network. So if a device is blasting out ARP requests at everything around it, it is essentially mapping the neighborhood. It's mapping your network, right? What devices are connected? Which IP addresses do they use? Which MAC addresses belong to them, right? And then this behavior went one step further. It started spamming those ARP requests against all of those devices once it identified them and causing those devices to go offline. And when their IP reservation dropped, SuperBox then took on that device's IP and its MAC identity and started posing as that device, right? So now it's a trusted device. So in plain English, this isn't just a streaming box. This is a device that's trying to learn what is on your network or who is on your network, disrupt them, and then blend in as something that's actually trusted. So this really matters in a work from home world. You buy a device like this for your house, or we all have kids. I have a teenager. These types of devices are like their world, right? So if that thing is on your network and you're working from home, you just took a personal risk that now is a company risk as well. So if your work laptop's on the same home network as that device, the trusted boundary is no longer just your house, it now touches your employer. So as leaders, we need to think about these things. And we need to realize when we have people working from home, we have to be aware of what's on the network. So it's not just laptops, not just phones. It's really everything because cyber risk often comes through convenience, right? So we shouldn't be monitoring our employees' home networks or anything like that. We should just make sure that we have sound policy in place for our employees and that they have a guest network set up at home, for example. All that stuff should be on the guest network. And they have a regular network set up at home where they're doing their regular work, right? That simple fix would have resolved this from being a company issue. So we can go to the next slide. We can bring this around back to your environment. So, most organizations have invested heavily in protecting corporate devices, and that's really important. But in a work from home environment, we've got smart TVs, security cameras, streaming devices, all kinds of things, gaming systems that are online. And most of these devices were not designed with enterprise security in mind. But yet they may exist on the same environment where our employees are accessing work systems. So, we don't patch them, we don't monitor them. Often we don't know they exist. So what should we be doing? In a remote hybrid work environment, organizations must think kind of beyond corporate-owned technology when assessing cyber risk and make sure employees are following good cyber hygiene tactics when they're at home. And leadership lessons. Well, first, the attack surface is larger than it was 5 years ago, right? With distributed workforce. Today includes home networks, connected devices, remote work environments. Second, visibility becomes increasingly important. We won't be able to control people's devices on a home network, but we need to understand how employees access corporate resources, what safeguards are in place. Are we letting them access from personal devices? Do we have lockdown devices that they can only use at home? Like all of these things should be thought about, right? So that we can eliminate that problem from our risk portfolio. So if Canvas kind of taught us about vendor risk and Coinbase taught us about insider risk, SuperBox is really environmental risk. The reality is corporate risk increasingly originates outside of corporate control, and we need to have policies in place in a work from home environment to account for those things. And we need to be thinking about those things as well. All right, Kim.
Yes. So now that Dave has covered each of these three incidents, curious to see if anyone's position has changed. And so forgive me while I navigate here. Let me launch the same poll again. So which area concerns you most now? So is it third party / vendor risk? Is it insider risk, remote work or device risk, or still, questioning that? Let's see, it looks like some answers are coming in. I see some changes already starting to form here from the original. And why don't we go ahead and end it, and I'll chat through some comparisons here. So let me share the results. I'll share that third party, excuse me, risk at the beginning of the session was 57%. Now it's at 53. Insider risk was originally at 5% of the audience. That's grown to 18. And remote work / device risk was 33%. Now that's down to 24. And then we've got still not sure has grown from 5 to 6%. So that's a bit of an interesting shift since the first time we asked this question. Dave, any thoughts?
No, not really. Hopefully you found the three examples insightful and got you to think about, I think we all start out in security really thinking about the protection aspect of what we have under our umbrella, right? And we don't really often consider, well, wait a minute, we've plugged all of these other vendors and other suppliers into our system now, and they're sort of part of our environment. Or, hey, we've expanded our team outside of the office, outside of our control. What access do they have, right? What are they allowed to do with that access, right? Or thirdly, have we trained our employees? Have we given them good awareness training on how to set up their home networks, right? So that their home networks don't impact our networks. All of those things are important. And, from the polling results, I can see people are interested in all of them, which is really great to see. So that's what builds a strong cybersecurity culture, starting to grow as the cyber threats grow and as the cyber threats change.
Yeah, good perspective. I think it's also a good reminder of just the dynamic nature of the cyber risk landscape and how it's constantly evolving. I think it goes away to kind of dispel the thought that cybersecurity is a one and done sort of prospect. Okay, well, we still have a lot of material to cover, so let's move on to kind of bringing it together, and I'll pass it back to you, Dave.
Sure. I think just to summarize here, like these are all different incidents, right? So when we think about the Canvas incident, okay, it was higher education, right? And the customers are the universities, the professors, the students, and in the K through 12, the teachers. But if you are white labeling some tool inside your organization that you present out to your clients, and imagine your clients logging in and seeing a ransomware note and thinking they had ransomware on their system, that's a scary thing, and that's a very difficult thing to explain um, to clients. And you have to start to think about how do I model that? Like, could this be a retention issue? Would I lose clients over this? And what we've seen is, yeah, there's a significant churn after organizations have a cyber incident. And then if it's publicized and you have to disclose it, what can that do to your revenue? So we need to think about these things in business terms, and we need to start thinking about, okay, which suppliers do we have? Um, and we like to do like this four box exercise. So it's like, are they integrated with our systems? Do they have our data? Um, are we white labeling, which we talked about? Or in some instances, they supply something to us that we need to, run our business. So like in the hospital example, right? We can't move patients out of an elevator. In a manufacturing example, we build something, but we rely on another company for one part. And if that company goes down to a ransomware incident and they're down for 21 days, we now can't build our product, right? So that's why it's really important to think about third-party risk. Insider risk, we just need to look at our policies, right? And we need to monitor our access control. We need to know who has access to what. We need to know what permissions they have and what can they do on our systems. And are they required to do those things? And if they are, what controls can we put around it to make sure that we reduce our risk as much as we can? A lot of times, just an elevated permission level is enough, right? If I'm going to provision an account in the Coinbase situation, I got to go to a supervisor and get authorization to provision that account, right? That probably would have stopped this particular situation. And then, SuperBox, I use that one for a couple of reasons. Number one, a lot of the leaders on this call might be working from home. We might have kids online. We might not know what their devices are, right? We should probably pay attention to this, number one. But number two, we should also have our home networks set up in a secure way, right? Where we're doing our work, our actual job function on a separate network from where all of our fridge is connected to, for example. Because how many of you know how to patch your refrigerator? Like if you connect it to the internet because you want to, I don't know, turn the temperature up and down or whatever it does, right? How do you patch that? How do we know if it has a critical vulnerability on it? We don't, right? So important things to consider. But what ties these things all together is these are external threats, right, to our organization. This is just like I think this is good because if you've been around IT security and cybersecurity for a long time, the traditional view is, hey, it's tools, right? We got firewalls, we got endpoint protection platforms, we got all of these different technology tools that protect our endpoints, protect our servers, protect our applications, right? But more and more, as we shore up our security in those areas, these threat actors are pivoting to, I'm just going to target the employees, right? I'm going to socially engineer the employees. So if we have untrained employees and they don't know how to recognize these things, and we're not doing very consistent cybersecurity awareness training on our employees, um, we're way behind the eight ball because we have to teach our employees how to recognize these threats, right? Super important. It's a more modern view of cybersecurity. We talked about vendors. I think partners also come into that conversation the same way that vendors do. What are our partners have access to in relation to our systems? So vendors, partners, contractors, I think those are all kind of tied together in that third party risk kind of conversation. We talked about connected devices, like even in our offices, what do we have connected and are we sure that those things are secure? And then obviously remote work environments, which we cover pretty extensively. So, as leaders, what questions should you sort of be thinking about? The first one is, what vendors could disrupt our operations if compromised, right? Do they supply something to us that would slow us down if they went down? So I always think of these things in the context of if they had a ransomware incident, and they were down for a significant period of time, how would that impact us, right? Um, which users have access, and could that cause significant harm? Do we know that? Are we tracking that? And do we know what permissions they have? What policies do we have in place, right? So a lot of these things can be prevented by good policy, but it's one thing to have policy. It's another thing to implement the policy, right? So have we implemented the policies that we have in place? And are we staying up on that, reviewing those annually, right? For our clients, we always review those policies annually. We make sure they're up to date with the latest things that we're seeing in the real world and how, these cyber threat actors are getting into systems. So we have to have policies, we have to make sure they're up to date, and we also have to make sure we've implemented those, right? Like we have those controls in place that the policy dictates we should have in place. Um, and then what risks exist outside our traditional security perimeter, which we talked about pretty extensively. So these are some things we should think about that are outside of your normal kind of thought process around cyber. All right, and a little 90-day action plan here. I know it says this week, this month, this quarter. We're kind of at the end of the week and at the end of the month. So, but that being said, in the short term, let's just say, I would say think about your most critical suppliers and if they could impact your business, right? Start to think about that. In the near term or in the midterm, just do a review of your privileged access, right? Who has privileged access? What permissions they have? What can they do in our systems, right? And then maybe a little bit longer term project would be think about your remote workers. Have we trained them on how they should set up their home network, for example? Have we talked to them at all about cybersecurity? Are we deploying just cybersecurity awareness training on at least a monthly basis to our people, not quarterly, not biannually, not not yearly, because that people don't retain information when they're given it quarterly or during onboarding or annually, right? It needs to be in front of them continuously for them to absorb it. And then I would also suggest in that area is, really if you're going to do cybersecurity awareness training, it should be positioned as an employee benefit, right? We want to help our employees understand how they can protect their families, how they can protect their kids that are online, right? How they can work more safely from home. And oh, by the way, we also have a policy at work, right? Because if you can give them something that benefits them in their personal lives, they're going to be way more engaged. They're going to be way more likely to take it. They're going to be way more likely to share it with their family members, which then by proxy secures all of us, and all of our organizations.
Great.
So one, maybe closing thought, attackers are still trying to break through defenses, but defenses are getting stronger. So increasingly what we see is they're exploiting what organizations already trust. And I think that's what these three incidents were about, right? We trust our suppliers and our vendors. We obviously trust our employees, right? And we trust connected devices because when we buy them, especially if it's on Walmart or Amazon, we're thinking, okay, this thing's got to be vetted in some way, right? It's not going to like be sending information back to China. But in fact, in that SuperBox case, it was. So these types of incidents are really sort of exploiting something that we already is trusted and should cause us to think a little bit outside of our firewall.
Good. Excellent. Excellent material. And I think, to expand on that, the trust piece, it's not that trust should be removed, it's that trust needs to be constantly validated, right? And revalidated. Yeah,
Absolutely.
fascinating examples, for sure, Dave. And I'll bring us in the final segment for today, which is our Q&A period. And I know we've gotten a couple questions in already. At this time, I'd encourage you to send in the questions that you have to the chat or the Q&A feature. And while we're waiting for additional questions to come in, I just want to offer a couple resources to you. The first two are downloadables. Dave had mentioned a few minutes ago this four-box method, and that is a worksheet that we often encourage organizations to use when they're trying to evaluate their vendor risk landscape. And so we're happy to offer that to today's attendees as well. And then additionally, we'd like to invite you to download our 2026 Cybersecurity Statistics and Benchmark Report, which is our annual report that conveys the current state of the cybersecurity space through the lens of more than 500 cyber risk assessments that SensCy has conducted. And then finally, should you have immediate concerns, we also invite you to take advantage of a free cyber health evaluation that SensCy offers to provide you with your SensCy score. So let me go ahead and turn to questions. We've gotten a really interesting question, Dave. Love your perspective on this one. So it's, as a company, we provide cell phones for our employees. Some of our employees don't want to carry two phones, so they use the one company phone for personal and company use, meaning they access company and personal information slash apps on one phone. So now, after learning about the environmental risk with the SuperBox, for example, I feel like this could be a big risk. What do you recommend to try and lessen risk in this situation? Very well written, by the way. What do we recommend to try and reduce and lessen risk in this situation?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things you can do. If you're issuing two phones, then you know you need to have you need to make sure that you restrict access to systems on non-work phones. If you're trying to go down to one phone, which we see a lot nowadays, right? I mean, the phones are getting expensive. It oftentimes doesn't make sense. People don't want to carry around two phones, right? The great news is there's these mobile um, device management tools that are out there that are the price of them come down dramatically. But what's really nice about them is they're now able to differentiate on your phone. They're able to segment your phone. So if I have my personal, let's say on an Apple iPhone, right? I have my personal iCloud account, and then I have my Dave Kelly at SensCy.com account, right? Um, the tools can segment the phone, right? And only do security on the work side of the phone, right? So if something happened on the personal side of the phone, it would not impact the work side of the phone, which then allows, your IT team to do other things like the device gets lost, we can shut it off. That somebody leaves employment and doesn't return the phone, we can shut it off. The device gets something on it, right? We get alerted to it. We can, mitigate that, but we're not at all in any way looking at their personal information. So most time this comes again with a policy, right? A condition of employment policy. Hey, if you're going to use your personal phone, that's fine. We're going to install this mobile device management software on it, and it's only going to be on the work side of the phone. It will not be looking at anything that's personal. That's why most companies and modern companies are handling it today.
All right, excellent. Thanks for sharing that answer very much, Dave. The next question is, how do we download these worksheets? It's not clickable on my end. So forgive me. I should have mentioned this before. So the QR code, of course, you're welcome to scan that at any time, but I will send out a recording of today's presentation in an email. It will likely be later today or tomorrow morning. I'll include links so that you can download these assets. And you can expect that in your inbox here shortly. Thank you for the good question. Appreciate it. All right, very good. I'm checking, and it doesn't look like we have received any additional questions. So I think we'll go ahead and bring today's session to an end, give you a few moments back in your day. But certainly, we want to thank you very much for spending a portion of your time with us today. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of your day and go ahead and look for that follow-up email from SensCy here tomorrow. Thank you again. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.